Welcome to Cities on the Frontline. Today we'll talk about migration and resilience. My name is Francis Guesquière. I'm the practice manager for urban development, disaster risk management, and other themes at the World Bank in the East Asia region, and I'm co-hosting this speaker series on behalf of the World Bank. We have two fantastic speakers today, which Lina will introduce in a minute. But before we start, let me remind everyone of the intention of this speaker series and the ground rule for the conversation today. The purpose of these global seminars is to have an open and honest learning conversation. The calls are not on the record, and we ask that you not attribute any comments unless you have the person's express permission to do so, and we will help you obtain this permission if needed. We have about 250 registered participants for the call today, so to facilitate the discussion, there's plenty of time for discussion today, we ask that you ask your question in the Q&A function of the WebEx. Please note that the recording of the session, as well as the PowerPoint presentation, will be posted online next Monday. Lina, over to you.
Francis. I'm Lina Liakou. I'm the Global Director for City Engagement and Knowledge for the Resilient Cities Network. As Francis mentioned, this week's session is on migration and resilience, with a special look into the book Move, The Forces Uprooting Us. This session is also organized in the framework of COP26 that is currently taking place in Glasgow. Now, why migration and resilience? Historically, migration has been an intrinsic part of how humans navigate the world. While trying to recover from the current pandemic, and as climate change tips toward full-blown crisis, we are entering into a new age of mass migrations. How will this next phase of human civilization look like? And how we can build a more resilient future? What is the role of cities within this context? And what are some existing actions and policies that cities are taking to prepare and thrive? These are some of the questions we will try to respond during our session today. We have the honor to have with us two great speakers. First, the author of the book Move, The Forces Uprooting Us, Parag Khanna. Parag Khanna is strategic advisor to governments and global companies, a best-selling author, TED speaker. He's also founder and managing partner of FutureMap, a data and scenario-based strategic advisory firm. Parag has written The Future is Asian, Commerce, Conflict and Culture in the 21st Century that preceded the Move book. He's also the author of a trilogy of books on the future of world order, beginning with The Second World, Empires and Influence in the New Global Order, followed by How to Run the World, charting a course to the next renaissance, and concluding with Connectography, Mapping the Future of Global Civilization. He's also the author of Technocracy in America, Rise of the Infostate, and co-author of Hybrid Reality, Thriving in the Emerging Human Technology Civilization. Parag was named one of Esquire's 75 most influential people of the 21st century and featured in Wired magazine's Smart List. He has traveled to nearly 150 countries and is a young global leader of the World Economic Forum. Thank you, Parag, for joining our session today. Our second speaker is David Groisman. David is Chief Resilience Officer and Director of Management Exchange at the Government of Buenos Aires in Argentina. He has been in this position since 2015, where he leads the development, promotion, and coordination of transversal cross-initiatives, ensuring the effective completion of the strategic priorities of government administration. Prior to this position, he was a consultant for international organizations and local NGOs in performance management, governance, and strategic planning, including the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, among others. He's a close partner of our network and a member of our Global Steering Committee. So without further delays, I would like to give the floor to Parag to introduce the topic and give an overview of the history and future of migration. We will then hear from David on the city perspective. So, Parag, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lena. Thank you, Francis. I'm delighted to be joining all of you today. You are the real experts on this topic of cities on the front line. And of course, the timing is appropriate given the COP26 summit and what a crucial, and potentially devastating role climate change plays in the future of migration and how it will impact cities. We all know the fundamental conditions as a point of departure, just how much of the world population lives in cities, just how many of those cities and what number of people live in coastal areas, and what impact that could have. And in my research, looking at the history of migration going back hundreds of thousands of years, and looking at the growing volumes of migration, one can draw certain conclusions, of course, about how the number of migrants has increased in lockstep and in some centuries disproportionately to the rise of population, while also, of course, fueling our global urbanization. And also the trends in terms of the drivers over time, whether they have been political, economic, or climate driven. And in some of that research that I put together in this book, it points, of course, to climate change being an ever greater driver of migration. Therefore, it's an appropriate moment to take stock and to maybe make some forecasts around where things might be going. So if we can just go to the first slide. Thank you so much, Nicole. Yes, so here's a map of the present distribution of the world population. So in other words, a map of human geography, if you will. So that means it has roughly 8 billion pixels, right? One for every person. And you can see the distribution, of course, as you know, the world population predominantly in Asia, or majority in Asia, and then concentrated in coastal areas along rivers and estuaries and so forth. Let's go to the next slide. And what you'll see happening here is this animation. And you'll see a map that has probably now become quite familiar, which is the suitability index, or the suitability change forecast that have been produced by multiple sources, looking at what happens as temperatures rise globally and the impact that that has on other climatological conditions, and what it means for the either rising suitability for habitation or the decreasing suitability for habitation, represented by green and red, respectively. So as you'll note, if you juxtapose these two, we have a very large share of the world population that currently resides in areas that are turning increasingly red on the map. Now, of course, again, during the COP26, for those who are not already familiar with the language of the so-called climate niche, there's obviously been a lot more reporting around this issue in terms of the latitudes, the latitudinal band, you might say, in which the majority of the human population has settled, and most densely within 20 and 30 degrees north latitude. And the hypothesis then is that as that climate niche shifts due to climate change, more and more people are displaced from geographies that had, if not optimal, then certainly suitable conditions or adequate conditions, are displaced, and therefore migration becomes a likely outcome. If we can go to the next slide, please. Or consequence, I should say, or certainly a scenario. So I have found that in the climate change dialogue and certainly in COP26, we have had, of course, an elevated importance of climate mitigation, and that can mean everything from, of course, decarbonizing industries, carbon capture storage, and of course, a rapid deployment of renewable technologies to reduce renewable energy sources to reduce emissions, and so forth. And according to a variety of sources, roughly 90+% of the total expenditure on climate-related matters, let's say, goes towards mitigation. And the balance, which is very little, is directed towards adaptation measures. And of course, I think that these need to be brought into greater balance, not by reducing what we spend on mitigation, because of course, I imagine all of us would agree that we should expend even more resources, not just financial, but also political, technological, and so forth, into mitigation issues. But at the same time, I think all of us appreciate that climate adaptation is not something that can wait either. It is also an emergency of yesterday, of today, and increasingly of tomorrow, given the number of people who are already internally displaced around the world due to climate change or internationally. And that number is going to grow no matter what measures are agreed upon at COP26 in this resolution and previous summits and future summits. So I do think that we need to have a sort of at least an appropriate increase in efforts that relate to adaptation measures. And adaptation can take many forms. It can certainly be infrastructural. We can talk about those measures, whether it is building seawalls for coastal cities, whether it is, of course, building insulation and other kinds of interventions that can be made in cities or elsewhere. And we should also talk about climate migration as a form of adaptation. This can be voluntary or involuntary, but either way, there is little doubt that not just in a hypothetical world, but in the real world, migration is one of the principal mechanisms for individuals or larger population groups to adapt to climate change. But of course, this runs up against many obstacles and barriers, such as, of course, sovereignty, borders, the lack of a common approach to migration globally, which, quite frankly, if we are honest, we're not really going to have. So climate migration as an issue is more or less relegated to specific bilateral relationships, and it hasn't progressed much beyond that at this point in time. But from my work in geography and looking at, of course, some of the geographies that are likely to be more suitable for human adaptation or habitation, and the irony of the fact that those are the same geographies that are currently depopulating or have stagnating populations due to low fertility, higher mortality, and so forth, I believe that we need to give a lot of deep thought to reconciling these layers of geography, the geography of resources and the geography of people and the geography of borders and the geography of infrastructure are terribly misaligned today. And that was actually the point of departure for this book. It was not to advocate for migration per se, though of course I do, but it was to think about the realignment of these layers of geography. Let's go to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, I've been looking at these so-called climate oases, climate havens, geographies of greater suitability. Here is an adaptation from National Geographic magazine in which we looked at a couple of the places where you can already see significant population growth for a variety of reasons. Canada, for example, is on a per capita basis bringing in a larger number of immigrants every single year than any country in the world, and it's doing so as consciously as part of its economic strategy. In the book, I talk about Eastern Anatolia, which, as you can see here, is a region that is verdant, that has sort of strong fresh water availability. It's the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And this is actually a depopulating geography because the Turkish population has been shifting from east to west. Meanwhile, of course, the immediately southern countries to the southeast of Turkey that it borders, specifically, or in particular, Syria, Iraq, and Iran, are countries with substantial populations, particularly Iran, in which, of course, climate suitability is declining. And so you can imagine, a larger scale population transfer, and it could be, you could call them climate migrants, climate refugees, than are already the case. Now, remember, of course, Turkey is already the host to the largest number of refugees in the world at the moment, if I'm not mistaken, roughly 4 to 5 million total refugees already in Turkey. And here you have the scenario where potentially even more could be moving across that border for climatological reasons. Now, of course, there's many other geographies, and I can happy to speak more about them. Let's go to the next slide, actually. Right. So, these dots actually just represent specific parts of the world that I have chapters on in the book, just to highlight what might be happening in terms of their suitability for habitation changes, and of looking not just at the climatological conditions, but also the political conditions, the cultural, the economic. and kind of profiling these regions as places where, or as symptomatic or representative in their own way of various conditions that are emerging that speak to the issue of what happens as populations are growing or might be growing as a result of climate change and other factors. So I talk, of course, about the Great Lakes region on the US-Canada border, multiple parts of Europe, whether it's the British Isles or the Alpine region. Of course, I talk about Russia, multiple parts of Russia, especially Western Russia and the far east of Russia, Kazakhstan and Central Asia, and so on and so forth. So I kind of profile these geographies as places that certainly from a strictly technical standpoint, could absorb larger populations. The question is, will they, and what would it entail? Again, part of it is hypothetical, but part of it is also very real, and it's happening more and more. And one of the examples of that is the larger number of South Asians, particularly Indians, that I have seen in Central Asian countries like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. And next slide, please. So this, one of that example that I just gave, actually, of South Asians, moving north, is not part of the human migration story of the past 100,000 years. There is the possibility that any number of vectors of future migration really are quite novel in history. We have maps, that we have archaeological records that show us, the approximate path of humankind's migrations out of Africa over the last many centuries, and how we have spread across the world. And of course, the patterns of settlement around the world due to the last ice age and the retreat of the last ice age about 12,000 years ago. And increasingly, we have a sense, obviously, the more contemporary we look, the more recent we look in time, what the most kind of normalized, let's say, or stable patterns of migration have been. Here, what I've done is to kind of represent over the past couple of decades, basically since the end of the Cold War, what has been the stock and flow of migrants. And it's mostly intra-regional, or in the case of the Western Hemisphere, intra-hemispheric. Migrants within the former Soviet Union represent the largest single category, South Asians to the Gulf countries, Africans within Africa, Europeans within Europe, and so forth. And of course, I think that some of this is, of course, these lines, these vectors are going to change and point in new directions. And if you recall the climate stress and suitability map, South Asia is an increasingly, climate stressed region. You can imagine it being an origin of an ever larger diaspora of outbound migrants, again, due to climate change and other factors. Of course, the South Asian diaspora already is the second largest in the world behind the Chinese diaspora. But in the coming decades, given India's youth and climate stress, it could become larger. And you could imagine, again, new vectors of South Asian migration westward towards Europe, north into Central Asia, and so forth. Similarly, of course, we do see, African populations moving north, Arab populations north and west, and so forth. So part of what I've been doing is kind of looking for the early signals of which geographies are, or which new inter-regional migration patterns are emerging in the world, and kind of hypothesizing about what their volumes might be over time, given climate change, politics, labor shortages, and other factors. Next slide, please. So more broadly, let's remember, in terms of global demographics and human geography, as I mentioned in that very first slide, the majority of the human population actually lives right here on this, inside this rectangle. Roughly 5 billion people live here. And this geography of the eastern 2/3 of Eurasia, but we could also say Eurasia as a whole, does represent the largest volume of new infrastructure investment, the geography of many new trade agreements, cross-border projects, and investment agreements as well, and also migration patterns in terms of Chinese outbound populations, Indian, Arab, and the other groups that are represented here on this map. So in many ways, the future of human geography is the recirculation and the redistribution of populations here within this rectangle. And of course, what's interesting and tragic at some level is that if you think about the exposure to climate change and to climate factors, because the majority of the world population is in Asia, it also represents the majority of the population that's exposed to these risks worldwide, whether it is floods, droughts, rising sea levels, or other climate phenomena. And so if you think about, again, the number of megacities in the world, most of them are in Asia, most of the ones that are coastal are in Asia, therefore most of the risk is actually concentrated here in Asia. So here, by showing you what the major infrastructure projects across borders have been, it's also a reminder that a lot of the infrastructure investment that is being made worldwide, and especially here in Asia, could constitute stranded assets in many ways if we don't make future infrastructure investments, or from the current moment into the future, with climate change in mind. There could be, again, a lot of redundant stranded assets. And therefore, when we think about infrastructure finance, Belt and Road, and the many responses to Belt and Road, and the multilaterals that have now gotten engaged in infrastructure finance, we need to be thinking not just about those infrastructures and their sustainability from the standpoint of their energy consumption, resource consumption, the way we are now in the form of ESG kind of impact and so forth, but also think about the geography of those investments in the context of a rapidly changing climate. And if we were to do that, what would these lines look like? Where would they be? Where would the railways and electricity grids and internet cables and highways and so forth, where would they be? Where would cities be located, new city projects, or the migration of people from one city to another? And I think that this is part of what dynamic spatial planning and infrastructure investment needs to be, how it needs to be done in the future. Next slide, please. So now I'm actually going to wrap up with these are slides. The next couple of slides I would like perhaps just to be shared with people, but I've tried to start to put together kind of a typology of the sorts of investments that are being made at the municipal or national level in terms of infrastructural adaptation to climate change. So the sort of arcology, architecture, and ecology, things like proposals that maybe have not yet left the drawing board in some cases, like floating cities, coastal sea barriers obviously have movable infrastructures, biomimetic architecture. This is some examples that I give here. If we can go to the next slide. Here I talk about the more mobile and portable energy storage technologies and materials that can be deployed in existing or new urban geographies or otherwise. And these are some of the ways in which we can have adaptive architecture for larger numbers of people, if you will, especially those who are in climate stressed areas, but in general, otherwise as well, just to make cities more resilient to climate factors and more energy self-sufficient through renewable energy technologies. So here specifically focused on battery-related technologies, though of course so much more investment is being made in wind and solar and other sources as well. Next slide, please. And so I mentioned wind just now. So, here again, I look at, sort of more contributions to microgrid kinds of technologies that emerge from wind. So there's some really obviously fascinating projects and experiments underway. So I mentioned here not only the sort of technologies themselves, but perhaps, but I mentioned here some of the key firms and innovators in this space. And I think the final slide is the next one. I think the next one is the final slide. And water, of course, being absolutely crucial. So the last two are water and construction technology. So how can we not only do a lot more in the area of rainwater collection, wastewater treatment and recycling, wastewater treatment and redirection into agriculture, hydroponic and aquaponic agriculture as well, in order to generate very high crop yields, but with less water intensity. And then there's a lot of interesting technologies around atmospheric water generation, and so forth as well. I think this is an exciting area and can obviously be of service to fairly large populations. Next slide, please. And here, just getting back to modular construction. And the final point I'll make here is around mobility. You know, I didn't set out, or perhaps I did set out, to kind of tell a story of what could be perceived as one-directional migrations. But I came to the conclusion that given how volatile the climate is becoming, there aren't necessarily places, despite the colors that the previous maps that give you a sense of confidence about certain geographies. The truth is that climate volatility is actually everywhere, and that is the nature of complex systems. So we can't be so sure of any one place, and we can't be so sure that ecologically it would remain stable as its population would expand significantly, and other kinds of factors. So again, in a very complex system that we live in, I emphasize throughout that it's not just about the one-way movement of people, but about mobility itself. Mobility for people, but mobility for our infrastructures also. So by emphasizing here things like modular construction or 3D printed housing and other technologies, it's really about the mobility of our civilization, the mobility of our habitats, and I think that we need to think in those terms increasingly if we want to be better able, better capable of adjusting to shifting climate conditions wherever they may be over the next 10, 15, 20, 30 years. So let me just stop right there and pass it back, and I'm really looking forward to the rest of our conversation together. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Parag. It was actually very interesting how you tied the kind of global overview and the different kind of migration trends with actually real solutions, and the connection around resilient infrastructure, as we also call it, with the kind of human geography. So also we're gonna change scale, and we're gonna focus on the city scale and the level of local governance. So David, we look forward to hearing about Buenos Aires and the policies around migration and the point of view that the city has around this trend.
Now, let me know if you are looking for the screen.
Yes, all good. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you. I am very pleased to be sharing this panel with Parag to discuss migration challenges, pandemic, and climate change. I would like to thank Francis, Lina, and Resilient City Network the opportunity to join and present some of City of Buenos Aires experience, which may reflect to some extent a reality shared by many Latin American cities. Argentina and the city of Buenos Aires in particular have an intrinsic history shaped by migration. Our country, our nation, our country and our nation has had an open door policy towards international migration. In fact, our constitution since 1853 has promoted international migration and welcomed warm-hearted people who have chosen Argentina to work and contribute to its wealth. Our traits and our culture is deeply rooted with those who came in the early 90s, escaping famine. Indeed, Argentinian culture, particularly urban culture, is a syncretism that still today reflects the Spanish and Italian traditions that came with our grandparents. Our gastronomy culture, what we eat, and our languages, how we talk, our slang, is a big part of our people. However, the reasons for these migrations have become more complex and changed over the years. The places of origins, the impact in the destination countries have also shifted. Even the migrants' sociodemographics, the ages, family composition, job, and academic training also have changed drastically from those migration waves we study in our history books. A long story short, There are several reasons for a person or family to choose to leave what is known to them and flee to another country. As Parag establishes in MOVE, there are three main reasons for migration. The first one, climate. The long-term phenomena such as rising temperatures and sea levels and falling water tables, but also seasonal disasters like floods and typhoons. The second one, political reason. Refugees and asylum seekers from civil wars and failing states, as well as those fleeing ethnic persecution or tyrannies. And the last one, economical issues. Migrants in search of opportunity, workers laid off due outsourcing, or employees forced into early retirement by financial crisis. Far from conservative or even reactionary points of view towards migration, deeply embedded in fear of what is unknown, Parag unlocks a quite simple but fierce statement that every civil servant addressing this issue ought to know by heart. Immigration is an economic stimulus. Migrants generate revenue, pay taxes, spend money, improve productivity, are entrepreneurs, they innovate. Migrants contribute to a country's wealth. Even students, university-driven migration has an uplift effect on cities' economies. Parag states that frugal college kids of today are likely to become the entrepreneurs of tomorrow. They will revitalize university towns, and when they move, they will turn Rust Belt towns into hubs for digitalized industrial design and advanced manufacturing. In the city of Buenos Aires, we are working hard to attract young talents, and we are exploiting our cultural and urban assets to promote that migration. Quality of life is a critical factor that both individuals and companies take into account when settling in a city, and Buenos Aires is a great city to live in. Buenos Aires has a world-class public, private, and independent cultural environment, and for many years has ranked as one of the most livable and safest cities in Latin America, according to The Economist. Diversity is also a key asset for a global city, and we definitely celebrate diversity as one of the 10 friendliest cities in the world for the LGBT community, and more than 50 communities living in Buenos Aires. Furthermore, in the last 14 years, our city has undergone a historical transformation, which implied a record investment in public works, as well as putting quality of life at the center of urban planning. This is why we have been working to transform Buenos Aires into a 15-minute city with more green and public spaces, better public transport, and better sustainable mobility. Buenos Aires' priority is to be leading global city on the climate change agenda. This year, we finished developing our new climate action plan, which is aligned with the Paris Agreement and targets carbon neutrality by the year 2050. Here in the city of Buenos Aires, we know that international students are key to boost the visitors' economy. We have already come a long way to attract them. 4 years ago, we created the Study BA program, which has helped us stand out internationally and attract foreign students. Buenos Aires is itself a huge university campus, 830,000 university students, and more than 40 world-class public and private universities. The QS Best Student Cities ranking continues to highlight Buenos Aires as one of the 25 best cities in the world for international students. In 2019, we received over 85,000 international students. Collectively, they spend 1% of the city's GDP in accommodation, university fees, and visits from family and friends. Our aim is to recover those figures by 2023 by providing scholarships and promoting the city overseas in markets like China. Another prominent trend during the pandemic is the consolidation of remote work or telework. which has accelerated the digital nomads trend. According to Netflix, the Work from Anywhere Index, Buenos Aires is the best city in Latin America for digital nomads and is among one of the best in the world, in line with destinations such as Paris, Boston, Hamburg, Rome, Amsterdam, and Shanghai. By 2023, we set ourselves the goal of attracting 20,000 digital nomads to Buenos Aires. To do so, we are working together with the national government on a special visa that will allow them to stay up to 1 year. We also launched a special program offering digital nomads incentives such as discounts on accommodation and co-working spaces, as well as personalized support to facilitate their stay. Still, this is how we are working to attract young people. Let me tell you what we started doing pre-COVID-19 when addressing Venezuelan migrants displaced in Latin America. Venezuelan political and economic crisis was displacing roughly 5.5 thousand people daily. Around 2.4 million, 80% of total, are in the Latin American region, under ACNUR and IOM publications ranked Argentina as the 6th largest recipient in the region. Before COVID-19 closed our borders, approximately 130,000 Venezuelans migrated to Argentina. 4 of every 5 migrants established in Buenos Aires metropolitan area. 51% of Venezuelan migrants who arrived between 2015 and 2018 have a university degree versus 35% of people over 20 years of age in the city of Buenos Aires. 40% of Venezuelans are unemployed, and more than 70% of the workers of the gig economy platforms are recent migrants, especially from Venezuela. According to estimates by the Venezuela Association in Argentina, migrants take between 1 and 2 weeks to get an informal job, 3 weeks to get a formal job, not necessarily related to their profession, and up to 1 year to get a formal job suited to their needs and their profession's studies or abilities. They carry out a late labor insertion, but they begin to contribute to the city the year of arrival. Likewise, Venezuelans are the first migrant community in vocational training centers. Facing this issue, we rapidly took a resilient approach. We read certain indicators that estimated that migratory trend will continue to increase. The Venezuelan migratory wave confronts us with the need to anticipate the main challenges, especially those that imply tensions in the city's systems. Faced with a complex scenario, the city proposed an integrated and coordinated response between sectors where migration is a central element to development. The resilient team quickly designed a cross-sectional working table with representatives from every ministry to identify potential weaknesses in coping with the provision of the city services, especially these related with education and health provision. Every other month, the cabinet ministers gather around this cross-sectional agenda to keep monitoring advances and the appearance of new issues. Likely, our main challenges were not around the provision of services or goods. That is to say, the number of pupils you can have at one school or the amount of people you can provide medical services, but were unintendedly in the formal access. Many of the city services, from city bikes to requesting a driver's license or even creating a clinical history in your local health center, require a valid national ID. And most Venezuelans fleeing their country came to Argentina and many other countries in the region without their documents or IDs. And those that were stressing the capability of migration national offices to provide permanent or temporary IDs. When these issues arose, we very hastily changed the backends of the government platforms to cope with almost any ID, any type of ID, passport, temporary IDs, or country's origins ID. These changes were very, very tiny, but allowed us to cut out many challenges that could have emerged during lockdowns and government-obliged digitalization. The path of integration implies working on certain tensions that are beginning to emerge and favoring the passage from a vicious cycle to a virtuous one. The experience of other cities in the world has shown us that migration is not so much a problem to be solved, but a reality that must be managed. Our future challenges are aimed at thinking about comprehensive solutions in resilient way that allow us to prepare ourselves to process the impact of arrival of new migrants. Working on integration, on the social participation of migrants, on access to city services allows for the transformation of diversity and interculturality into an engine of development and growth. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thank you very much, Parag, for two very interesting presentations. It's great. We have plenty of time for Q&A, and I think I'm tasked to start the barrage of questions. I'll start with you, Parag. Parag, you started with the supranational level, and you argued in a way that we should look at migration first with a bigger perspective. Rather, you almost lamented that very often migration is only looked at national and even just binational level. And then you kind of zoomed in and you went and talked about what cities can do, and you talked about particularly about technologies, but I was surprised technologies that in a way would help avoid migration because they help cities deal with adaptation. My question to you is if we know that we're gonna have migration, and as David very well argued, migrants are really an economic assets. They help as an economic stimulus. In your research, have you looked in particular at policies that cities can apply that help them harvest really the benefits of migration for their own economy? And then, David, we can then move to you. You presented a lot of the things that Buenos Aires is doing, but I'm sure that there are things that you really dream of doing and you have not yet been able to do. And so if you could tell us a little bit, what would be your ideal intervention or policy? But we'll start with Parag. Parag, so policy action that you think cities, or that you've observed that cities have done that help them harvest the benefit of migrants.
Yeah. Thank you, Francis. Actually, I think you asked two really great questions. The first is, if our interventions were to succeed, wouldn't that diminish climate-related migration in cities? And the answer is, ideally, yes. If a seawall works, for example, if Jakarta does successfully complete its sea barrier, then perhaps that would reduce the risk to the city from sea level rise. However, we know that, again, the environment is a very complex system. It's not only sea level rise that the city faces. Subsidence is itself a threat, and subsidence emerges simply from excessive construction activity in the city and the depletion of the existing groundwater and reducing water table. So there's really so many things that do drive migration in and out. And of course, one has to think about droughts, 0-day water events. One has to think about just tropical storms. And this affects, of course, American cities. There's a lot of things that have been done to attempt to fortify infrastructure in the city of New Orleans in Louisiana. And America is a wealthy country. And yet the population of the state of Louisiana is declining. And it's declining rapidly. And this is what the most recent US Census shows. And they have not actually, even where they have invested in resilience, in the sense, for example, in a very specific sense of spending hundreds of millions of dollars on electricity cables, on the power lines, they have not built them to withstand the strength of the storms that have been hitting them, such as Hurricane Ida just a couple of months ago. And so clearly it's not enough. So as much as I would like to see us do many things that relate to flood control measures and other kinds of things in cities. Clearly, there are cases where it will hopefully be sufficient and places where it won't. So I think, we have to, of course, be prepared for everything. In terms of the kind of more sociological question, in a way, our great cities in the world today are themselves evidence of, the virtues of, gradual, but certainly open migration to people from all corners of the world. There is a one-to-one correlation between the cities that are considered or ranked, to the extent that these rankings have, genuine, kind of objective basis. But, the places like New York, Los Angeles, and Toronto, or London and Dubai and Singapore and whatnot, the places whose populations have grown and are considered, thriving, stable, localities, are also places that have a high foreign-born population. So cities can succeed in that sense by being what they have been. And of course, from learning from each other in terms of integration of migrants. It's not obviously just a passive process. It has been in some ways an organic process, but not a passive one. But it can also be a more proactive one in places that also, are, for example, climate resilient and have labor shortages that need to be filled. We've seen, how in the course of Brexit, London was vehemently against it, and the London mayor said we might have to issue place-based visas for our city. In the United States, when the Trump administration wanted to execute far larger volumes of deportations of undocumented migrants, cities such as New York began issuing ID cards to undocumented migrants so that they would have documentation. So these became known as sanctuary cities. So I've seen policies like that. Then, of course, there's more labor market kinds of areas. And I think it's very interesting how David mentioned, the measurements that we have around the amount of time that it takes for a migrant to enter the labor market, and, in what sectors and those kinds of things. This is very useful data. And I do think that we can actually, there's a phrase, there's an app for that. And this is something for which there should be an app. Cities can have apps. They say, are you a migrant? And especially in the Spanish-speaking world, this is really can operate across borders very, seamlessly almost. What city are you in? It's in one language. Where are the places you should go if you're looking for a job? What maybe hotspots where jobs are available and people drop a pin, this kind of thing. For the sort of, in the book, I actually have an example of this. I call it Tinder for jobs. So many people are familiar with the Tinder dating app. So if we can make an app like this for dating, surely we can do the same thing for jobs. And you can use the simplest of machine learning algorithms would match people's declared skill sets and keywords to the geography where those skills are in demand in the market, in the private sector or otherwise. So a Tinder for jobs is a very simple solution to minimize the degree of migrant unemployment. Now, that may seem humorous, but if you think about the crisis in Europe right now, with the large numbers of migrants from Africa and Arab countries and as far as Afghanistan that are in Greece right now, that are in Italy right now, this is not a hypothetical scenario. And these are the case studies that I use. I traveled, in precisely these places and visited their camps and sort of ghettos, if you will. And I said, why don't, these are countries that have labor shortages in so many sectors, that are underproductive economically in many areas, countries that have high debt levels and declining populations. And yet these people are here, these migrants are here. And if they're going to stay, they can be very rapidly be deployed as productive members of the labor force. And I find it, tragic, sad, pitiful, and utterly avoidable, of course, a situation. So I'd like to think that we can, it wouldn't take much for one proactive mayor or city official or administrator or someone in the private sector, of course, to do this. One, city by city, or create the simple platform that can be adopted across multiple cities. And that would also further advance the cause of a productive integration of migrants.
David, Tinder for jobs in Buenos Aires?
I think it's a very good idea. Really, in certain, there is a multiple different platform, different department, different areas, different special windows in the city of Buenos Aires available for jobs to facilitate people and especially for migrants to have this accessibility. I think it's a very we have to see. I don't know, especially of a Tinder of a shop, but I think that we as a government, of course, we need to facilitate the access to shops and to facilitate this kind of links and especially soft capacitations to get the job. We have certain areas like the CEDEL's office in a special vulnerable neighborhood that is Villa 31, with a lot of capacitation with soft capacitation for interviews to making a CV, and it's very successful with a special population like migrants. And we know that we have to do better, but it's a way that we have to facilitate to the population, of course.
And we have actually a couple of questions from the audience that it would be good to also highlight. So the one comes from Elzbieta, who is in Glasgow at COP26. So it's great that she has joined us. Now, her question is around making displacement safe. So how can we institutionalize community-led mitigation and adaptation approaches in national and international systems in order to make those places safer and less vulnerable for the displaced? So, Parag, do you want to take this question?
I thought this might be a question more for David. Do you want to go first, or in terms of making places safe? Well, let me just make one comment that's sort of, I think, sort of universal. One of the principal challenges in all urban habitats around the world, truly one of the common challenges of city life, is, of course, affordability. Right. And one of the technological interventions and market interventions and policy interventions that's been crucial, that's emergent at this point, is building more affordable housing, whether it is a sort of pre-built sort of habitats, or whether it is using 3D printing and flat pack modular construction, these kinds of things. We can actually build sort of affordable and sustainable housing at a much larger scale, much faster than before. So, of course, this is part of something that we should already be doing in many places where we know that people are coming. So for whatever reason, whether it's political, refugees or climate migrants. So I think that would be, in terms of the spirit of the question is almost, in terms of the urgency of the situation at the ground level in these places. And the fact is that rather than 10 cities, we should be thinking about having more organized settlements, if you will, and we can use some of these new tools to facilitate that. So that's actually just one kind of partial solution or one step in the process, but I just wanted to highlight that one.
Thank you, Parag. David, in terms of urban planning, how does this resonate? And how can the city actually change its urban planning policies in order to make those places safer?
Well, 2 years ago, we actually modified the urban code, but we have been working in the last 5 years, making a lot and constructing a lot of affordable housing for different areas of the city that have a lot of adapting problems or issues of adaptations with the climate change, and we have to displace and improve the quality of the housing of these people. And we have a challenge, a bigger challenge with the pandemic, because in the center of the town of the city, and I think it's a problem of several cities, that the function of the town of the city is changing with the pandemic and the COVID-19. And I think that we have a bigger issue with these changes, and we are running a process. We are starting running a process in the city of Buenos Aires to rethink the town of the city because the pandemic. And it's going to be a participatory process, and it's going to be a long process, but definitely it's going to change the shape and the functions of our city town center.
David and Parag, another question that we have in the chat from Gehendra Gurung, who's asking really what could be the proportionate contribution to migration between economic reason, climate reason, and I can think of other reasons, political conflict, but also COVID. David, I'm sure you've seen dramatic changes in the type of migrant that, or have you seen changes in the migration flow, the type of migrant, why do they come? Do you think that's going to change again when hopefully COVID recedes? And are you integrating this in your policy? And then Parag, maybe the bigger picture, which of these they're all interconnected, so obviously it's hard to separate them, but which one keeps you up at night since you've looked at the big picture overall? Let's start with you, David, and the case of Buenos Aires.
Yes, as I told before, the reasons for migrations changed a lot during the different decades in Buenos Aires and in Argentina. We have always received migrants since the beginning of the century, but for different reasons. The most important migrants in the last 5 years came from Venezuela, and this was really very visible in the city. And it was, we have to deal with this every day. But I am not very sure that it's going to change with the COVID-19. We are not very sure that it's going to change. Maybe, of course, during the pandemic, the borders were closed, and we didn't have a lot of movement during the last 2 years. But I think that now we are open the frontiers, and it's going to return the flows of migrations from Venezuela. And it's very important from the migration here in Argentina. Before the Venezuela migration, it's really very a flow very significant from the countries very near to Argentina, like Bolivia, Peru, Paraguay, and it depends a lot with the different rate about the change of the currency, respect with the dollar in Argentina. Is we are very high or are very low, the direction of the flow changes very rapidly. But after the COVID, I think that we are going to return with the flows of migration with Venezuela.
Okay, I'm not on mute. Let me switch gears on this, answer the macro question. Over the course of centuries, as I said, the sort of aggregate number of migrants has increased, and now the share of those that one would classify as climate migrants has risen. We're early in this century, but you can well imagine that it could be that climate migration will outnumber others. But that said, I think for those of us, we're looking at the data and wanting to parse it and ascribe, categories and so on, that's fine. But as we well know, there are many situations today where migration is multi-causal. And you can obviously go back to, the famines in 19th century Europe and say, well, that was a bad harvest, but is also poor governance and so on. So which was it? How do you want to categorize it? So, I don't believe in being overly narrow in classifying these things, but of course, again, big picture overall, there's no question that climate is rising as a proportion of the number of internally displaced and international migrants.
Thank you, Parag. Thank you, David. Unfortunately, we're on time. I think we could have this discussion going for another kind of a couple of hours. I want to thank you both. I think this was a truly resilient discussion. I mean, trying to understand how we can make our communities, our systems, our cities resilient, not only to, kind of be prepared and survive, but actually thrive in the face of the different kind of shocks and stresses. And being able to discuss migration through this perspective and bring a different kind of also narrative to the problem, I think it was very, very interesting for all of us. So thank you again. Thank you all for joining. Please join us in the next session, which will focus on the outcomes of COP26 and a kind of a reflection session on what happened in Glasgow the last couple of weeks. And have a great rest of the day, wherever you are. So thank you again.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lina, Francis, Parag.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everyone.